Hello again, this is Professor Michael Fournet, and this is Intro to Microeconomics. This is the third week of the course, and for this week we're going to look at Chapter 8, which looks at two bodies of theory. One body of theory is called production theory, and the other body of theory contained in that chapter is called cost theory. And so in this chapter, what we're going to be observing is when a business engages in production, that is, takes inputs and converts them to output, we want to see how production changes as the mix of resources is altered. That is, if you have a certain number of workers using a certain number of machines, how does it ultimately affect production? And then once we get a handle on the production side, then we want to see how costs are affected based on the productive activity of the firm. Because obviously if a firm engages in production to acquire the inputs, it's going to have to incur cost. And so we want to see how costs are affected in the production of goods and services as well. So we'll start this chapter by looking at the production side of the equation first. And there are some concepts in the chapter, like the types of inputs and things of that nature, that you really want to be comfortable with as we go into this discussion. I will highlight some things I will assume that you have read in the book so that you can understand the cost of production story as I'm about to tell it. So we'll start by looking at production theory. And some of the concepts you have to be aware of, as I just mentioned, you have to know the types of inputs. And basically the inputs fall into two categories. There are fixed inputs and there are variable inputs. Fixed inputs would be like capital, machinery, and variable inputs would be like labor, because as you produce more output, you'll need more workers, and so the amount of workers you have varies with the level of production. We're going to assume that capital, at least in what's called the short run, is fixed. That is, you have a certain number of machines, and you want to vary the number of workers using this fixed number of machines just to see how production is affected. We have to make a distinction between the short run and the long run. The short run and long run have less to do with time. When you're talking about the short run, if you can identify any type of fixed inputs, you are by definition in the short run. So the short run is where fixed inputs exist. The long run, on the other hand, is where only variable inputs exist. So in the short run, you will have some fixed inputs, whereas in the long run, you will have no fixed inputs. And I've constructed an example to illustrate the difference. The central issue, or the central governing issue of production theory, is something called the law of diminishing marginal returns. And what this law basically says, if you have a business and you have a certain amount of fixed inputs, that is, you have a certain number of machines, and you vary the number of variable inputs, that is, you vary the number of workers using this fixed number of machines, eventually we're going to see some negative impact on production. If I have a fixed number of machines and I keep adding more workers to use this fixed number of machines, eventually at some point productivity is going to start to suffer. And we want to try and isolate when that deterioration in production occurs. And the law of diminishing marginal returns will give us guidance as to how to find it. In production theory, one of the central concepts is the concept called total production labor, and that is simply output. So what the workers are producing, what the labor is producing, is output, goods or services. So total production labor is simply output. Alright, other concepts we have to be comfortable with are the concepts of average production labor and marginal production labor. Average production labor is defined, you take the total production of all the workers and divide it by the total number of workers employed. For example, if a business has 10 workers and those 10 workers produce 1,000 units of output, so the total production of labor is 1,000 units, and there are 10 workers, then on average each worker has produced 100 units in that group. So average production of labor looks at how much each worker within a group produces on average. So average product has this group focus. Okay. Contrast that with marginal product. Marginal product looks at the production activity of an individual worker. So we will say, okay, if you put a spotlight on one worker, how is he or she affecting production? So marginal product gives us insight about how that next worker we hire is going to affect production. So we could hire a worker who is very productive and would make overall production go up. We could hire a worker that's a slacker, would make overall production go down. Or we could hire a worker that's just as good as our group on average, and production would stay constant. So marginal product is the central one, because in micro you study individual behavior, and marginal product puts the spotlight on the individual worker. And we'll look at how to calculate it and how to track marginal product in this lecture. Alright, so when you look at the production process, it really is where you take inputs, which in this case we're taking land inputs to be a given, and you vary the number of workers and machines. So you have a certain number of machines and you vary the number of workers, right? And want to see how those different combinations of capital and labor, how they affect the production of output. So how is the output affected as we change the input mix? And the law of diminishing marginal returns, as I said earlier, is predicting that at some point production of output is going to suffer because we will have too many inputs that we're running through the production process. So what we're really trying to find in production theory, we're trying to find at what point does the production process become clogged up? At what point do we have too many inputs trying to produce output, and output starts to suffer? And so the law of diminishing marginal returns will help us define that point where the production process becomes kind of congested. Now, to kind of see this, to try and take production theory and kind of convert it to numbers and visual representation, I have created this example. And so I want to try and work through a short run production theory problem. And you start by having a table, and this table looks at what happens to production as we vary the mix, that is, to have different combinations of labor using a fixed number of machines. Now, the reason why this is a short run problem is because if you notice here in the capital column, the number of machines stays fixed at 1. So we have a fixed number of machines. Capital is our fixed input, so it doesn't vary. The labor column, on the other hand, varies from 0 workers to as many as 7. So we're varying the number of workers using this one machine, right? And so we want to see how production changes. And so in the total production column is where I'm hypothetically tracking what would happen to the output under different combinations of the inputs. For example, if we had one worker using that one machine, I'm asserting that that worker would produce 15 units. If we had 2 workers using that one machine, maybe having some sort of tag team approach, then those 2 workers would crank out 34 units, and so forth. And so what we want to find is at what point does our mix of workers and the machine become deleterious, in the sense that it causes production to actually suffer. All right. And so when you calculate, once you calculate the total, once you have the total production numbers, then you can calculate these 2 byproducts: marginal product of labor and average production. Again, marginal product is focusing on the impact of the next worker hired. How does he or she affect overall output? For example, I have the first entry here for marginal product of 15. And what that is saying is that when we went from no workers to that first worker, so we added the first worker, that first worker caused production to change from 0 units, no production, to 15. So we can attribute the 15 units that were produced to that first worker. So that first worker contributes 15 units of production to the output. We hire the second worker, and notice the total production increases from 15 to 34, So that second worker adds the difference, which would be 19 units. Because if I take the 15 units from the first and the 19 from the second, the sum of those two equals the 34. So the marginal product is telling us that as we add each worker, how much each worker is adding to the overall total production. Right? Now, if you notice that as we keep adding workers, each subsequent worker is adding less and less to the collection of total production. So that's telling me that as we adding more workers, those workers are becoming less productive because we have this congestion starting to take place in the production process. Right? Now, average product, if you remember, has that group focus, and so this first entry for average product of 15 is where you take the total production of 15 units divided by the total number of workers, which is 1. So 15 divided by 1 is going to give me an average product of 15. So basically my group consists of just one worker, and so it's not ironic that marginal product and average product are the same when you have only one worker, because that one individual is also your group. Now, the average product, the next entry for average product is 17, and that is calculated by taking the total production of 34 units and dividing it by the total group of workers, which is 2 workers. So you got 34 units produced, you have 2 workers, so each worker in that group produces 17 units on average. That's why it's called average production. And so each subsequent average value is calculated that way, where the average product tends to decrease as the congestion problem tends to become more severe in the production process. Alright, now for the marginal product, notice that its values go from initially from 15 up to 19. As long as the marginal product is increasing, 15 up to 19, that area that I've shaded in blue is known as the region of increasing returns, because as we are hiring more workers, each worker is giving us subsequently more and more additional output. Now, after we hire the third worker, notice the marginal product starts to decrease. As long as it's decreasing, like going 10, 4, 2, 1, as long as it's decreasing but still positive, that is known as the region of decreasing returns. Because as we're hiring each subsequent worker, each worker is producing a decreasing amount of output. So it's known as decreasing returns. Now, when the marginal product becomes negative, that is known as the region of negative returns, because we hired that worker, that in this case the 7th worker, and production actually would be less than if we had fewer workers, such as 6. So when marginal product is increasing, it's known as increasing returns. When marginal product is decreasing but not negative, it is known as decreasing returns. When marginal product is negative, it is known as negative returns. Alright, now another thing we can observe from this table is that there's what are called the marginal average principles. And the marginal average principles looks at how does an individual something, such as an individual worker, affect group something, such as in this case a group of workers. And so in the case of marginal production and average production, we have these scenarios. If when marginal product is greater than average product, that's like saying when the productivity of the next worker hired is greater than the average productivity of our current group of workers, we expect average product to increase. So what this says, if we hire someone who is more productive than our current group, when that more productive worker is added to the group, it's going to make average production for the group go up. Or if we hire someone in the second scenario, where that productivity for that next worker hired is less than for our current group, then average production for the group will drop. So if we add someone who's a slacker to a group of hard-working workers, that slacker is going to bring down the productivity of the group. And then the third scenario says if we add someone whose marginal product is equal to the average product of the current group, then the average product will remain constant. That is, if we hire someone who adds an additional 5 units of output, and our current group of workers are producing on average 5 units of output, then the average product stays the same. to kind of see this from the table, let's take a case where the marginal product in the red column, the marginal product is 19, and the corresponding average product is 17. So here the marginal is greater than the average. So that second worker we've hired is more productive than the current group. And so when the marginal is greater than the average then starts to increase. So when the marginal is greater than the average, the average goes up. It's less than the average. When the marginal product is less than the average falls. So when the marginal is less than the average falls to 12. Or when the marginal of 4 is less than the average of 12, the average falls to 10. So when the marginal is less than the average will decrease. Right? Okay. Now, if I take, for example, the total production column, if I take that column and graph it with respect to the output, with respect to the number of workers. If I graph total production, this column, with respect to the output, I get what's known as the total production function. And I've done that down below. Let's take a look. So I took the total production numbers and graphed them with respect to the number of workers. And if you notice, the resulting function starts out pretty steep, and then it starts to flatten out. And then at some point, production actually starts to decline. Where it starts to flatten out and eventually decline is reflecting that as you're adding workers to the process, productivity is starting to suffer. You simply have too many inputs as a result. Now, if I look at the behavior between marginal product and average product, if I graph those two columns, the marginal product column and the average product column, and graph them with respect to labor, I can then visually see this interplay between individual worker impact and group worker impact. Right? And to show that, down below I've taken the marginal product values, which I graphed here in green, and I also took the average product values, which I graphed here in this reddish color. And notice, whenever the marginal product, the green line, is above the average product, the average is rising. So when the marginal is greater than the average increases. Now once the marginal, this green line, drops below the red line starts to decrease. So when the marginal is less than the average starts to fall. And that is graphically consistent with the marginal average principles that we just introduced. So when the marginal is greater than the average is going up. When the marginal is less than the average is coming down. Right? So it's reflecting how an individual worker affects the overall production process. All right. Now, if we go back to our framework for production theory, from the short run example, the next thing we have to look at are costs. So the law of diminishing marginal returns has clued us that as you add more inputs, eventually output's going to suffer. What we also need to know is how will costs be affected based on the production process. And on the cost side, there are some equivalent concepts, like just as there were types of inputs on the production side, on the cost side there are types of costs. And guess what? There are two categories. There are fixed costs, which can be defined as the cost of fixed inputs, or in this case the cost of machinery. And there are variable costs, which represent the cost of labor, because labor is our assumed variable input. We also make a distinction between the short run and the long run, and the distinction on the cost side is the same way. The short run is where you can identify some fixed costs. So fixed costs only exist in the short run because fixed inputs only exist in the short run. And the long run is where you have only variable costs, because only variable inputs exist in the long run. So you have that type of symmetry in terms of those concepts. The law of diminishing marginal returns also governs activity on the cost side. And so from a cost perspective, the law of diminishing marginal returns says this. It says given some fixed costs, which would be the cost of our fixed inputs, as more variable costs are incurred, which would be labor costs, eventually something called marginal costs will increase. So when the marginal cost starts to increase, it's a sign that the production process is becoming clogged and congested and inefficient. Just as on the production side, when marginal products started to decrease, that was also a sign that the production process was becoming clogged and inefficient. So cost side, marginal costs will go up in response to inefficiencies in the production process. Production side, marginal product will go down in response to the inefficiencies in the production process. Other terminology on the cost side, you have total cost, where total cost represents the sum of the fixed cost plus the variable cost in the short run. So your total cost will represent the total cost of producing the output. And so in order to produce output, in the short run, you will incur fixed costs and variable costs, whereas in the total cost in the long run will be only variable costs. Okay. All right. So let's look further at cost concepts. So in the short run, we can define, again, short run is where you have fixed costs. So whenever you see any type of fixed cost, you are looking at costs from a short run perspective. So as defined here, total cost in the short run consists of fixed costs plus variable costs. And also we have average costs and marginal costs. So just like we had average production of labor and marginal production of labor on the production side, on the cost side we have average cost and marginal cost. Now, average cost, it tells us the cost of producing a unit of output within a group of units on average. How much does it cost to produce a unit of output being produced within a group of units of output? For example, if a business incurs $1,000 in total costs, so the fixed cost plus the variable cost is $1,000, and the business produces 100 units, right? So if its total cost of producing 100 units is $1,000, and it produces 100 units, then each unit in that group of 100 costs on average $10. So the average total cost is telling us how much it costs to produce a unit of output within a group of units of outputs that are being produced. How much it costs on average. Another way of defining the average total cost is the average fixed cost plus the average variable cost. And from your reading, of course, average fixed cost is simply fixed cost divided by quantity. And the average variable cost is, of course, variable cost divided by quantity. All right. So either way, you can define average total cost as total cost divided by quantity, or the sum of average fixed cost plus average variable cost. And I will demonstrate that in a second. All right, marginal cost tells us the impact of each additional unit produced on output, on the overall cost of output. So if a business is contemplating producing one more unit, the business should be concerned about how producing that next unit will affect its overall cost. Will producing that next unit make its cost go up? Will producing that next unit make its cost go down? Will producing that next unit have no effect on the business's overall cost? Marginal cost tells us that. It tells us the impact of the next unit produced on overall cost. Right? So those are the basic concepts in the short run. What we need to do is now we need to play with them. We need to see how they behave, how to calculate them, and how they behave graphically. So let's attempt to do that. All right, and so to do that, let's introduce a cost table, what's known as a short run cost table, And the reason why this is a short run cost table is because I can identify fixed costs. So in column 2 I see fixed costs in this average fixed cost column. So whenever you see fixed costs, whenever fixed costs are part of the discussion, you are by definition in the short run. And so we want to look at some of the concepts and see how they're calculated. Alright, so in this example I let the output vary from 0 units to 8. So we've got production occurring over a range of 0 units up to 8 units. And if you notice in the second column, the fixed cost, which would be the cost of machinery, is constant, is fixed. So the fixed costs are not changing as production of output changes. The variable cost column, column 3, that represents labor costs. So if you got no production, presumably you have no workers, and so your variable cost would be 0. And so as more output is produced, notice the variable costs go up because you need more workers to produce more output. The total cost column, what I call column 4, notice it's the sum of the second column, the fixed cost, plus the third column, the variable cost. So you add those two together and it gives you your total cost. The average fixed cost column, the way I get those entries is I take the fixed cost from column 2 and divide it by the quantity. So to get the first entry of 50 here, I took the fixed cost of 50 and divided it by 1. To get the next entry of 25, I took the fixed cost, which doesn't change in this case, and divided it by 2. 50 divided by 25. 50 divided by 2 is 25. To get the next entry of 16.7, I took the fixed cost of 50 and divided by 3, and so forth. Notice the average fixed cost is getting smaller as the output increases. The numerator fixed cost doesn't change, and so when the denominator gets bigger, the fractional value of average fixed cost gets smaller. The average variable cost column, those numbers are calculated by taking the variable cost and dividing it by the output. So to get that first entry for average variable cost of $15, I take the variable cost of 15 and divide it by 1. To get the second entry of 12.5, I take the variable cost of $25 and divide it by 2. So average variable cost is simply variable cost divided by quantity. Now the average total cost, as we saw earlier, can be calculated really two ways. You can take the average fixed plus the average variable to get the average total. So if I take, for example, 50 plus 15, the sum of those two equals 65. The other way I could calculate the average total cost is I could take the total cost, like in column 4, and divide it by the corresponding quantity. So 65 divided by 1, of course, would give me 65. Or I could take the total cost of 75, divide that by 2, and that would give me 37.5. So either way you do it, taking the average fixed plus the average variable to get the average total, or taking the total cost and dividing it by the corresponding output, the result would be the same. Now, the marginal cost, again, the marginal cost is telling us the impact of the next unit produced on the business's total cost. How does the total cost change by producing one more unit? And let's see. We start at 0 output with total cost being 50. When the first unit is produced, the total cost increased from 50 to 65. That's a change of 15. Now, when that second unit is produced, here, when the second unit is produced, the total cost changed from 65 to 75. So 75 minus 65, that difference is 10. So the marginal cost is tracking how, as we produce the next unit, how that next unit produced is affecting the overall cost. Right? And so that gives us the marginal cost column. Now, a couple of things to observe here. The marginal average principles also apply to cost. So notice here, when the marginal cost is greater than the average cost, and the average cost could be either average variable or average total, the average cost will increase. And we can see that from the numbers. Let's take the case where the marginal cost is $10 and the corresponding average variable cost is 12.5. So the marginal cost is 10. The average variable cost is 12.5. So the marginal cost is less than the average. And when the margin is less than the average, notice that the subsequent average drops to 11.3. So, just as we said here, when the marginal cost is less than the average cost will decrease. And so, embedded in the data are these principles. When the marginal cost is less than the average cost falls. When the marginal cost is greater than the average cost rises. And if the two are the same, the marginal cost equal the average cost would be constant. Okay, so those are the cost concepts. I can see their relationships. I see how to calculate them. The next thing I have to do is graph them, because I want to be able to see study their behavior visually. And we'll start by graphing fixed costs, variable costs, and total costs. Those three. So I want to graph those three concepts those three series in the same framework. I'm going to graph them as output changes. Now, looking at the fixed cost column, notice the fixed cost stays at 50 as the output changes. And so if I were to graph that series, the fixed cost would graph as a horizontal line, because it's locked in at 50 in this case. The variable costs, I see the variable costs generally are going up. They increase as we produce more output because we need more workers. So the behavior of the variable costs are getting larger as the output increases. It should be kind of upward sloping. The total cost, notice the difference between the total cost number and the variable cost number is always the amount of the fixed cost. So the total costs are also going up. And if you notice that one way of thinking of the total cost, there's simply the variable cost shifted up parallel by the amount of the fixed cost. So the fixed cost would be horizontal, the variable cost would be upward sloping, and the total cost would also be upward sloping, but they would be shifted up by the amount of the fixed cost. And so if we graph those 2, 3, and 4 columns, the graphical depiction looks like we expected. The fixed cost, the blue line, is horizontal. The average variable cost is upward sloping, increasing as output increases, and the total cost is also upward sloping. And notice how it parallels the variable cost. And the vertical difference between the green line and the red line is the amount of the fixed cost. Okay, so those concepts behave as we would expect. I also need to look at the average cost and the marginal cost to see how they behave graphically. It's going to be very useful for us in later work. Notice the average fixed cost column. Let's start with that one. The average fixed cost column starts at 50, then it drops to 25, and it keeps dropping subsequently. So the average fixed cost, if you were to graph it, is going to be decreasing as the output increases. So it's going to be a downward sloping decreasing function. The average variable cost is interesting. It starts out in this example at 15, it drops to a low of 10.4, and then it starts to increase thereafter. So the average variable cost seems to be kind of U-shaped. It starts at 15, bottoms out at 10.4, and then starts to increase. The average total cost starts relatively large, starts at 65. It too starts to decrease. It keeps decreasing from 65, going down to a low of 18.4, and then it starts to increase as well. So the average total cost has also kind of exhibiting a U-shaped behavior. The marginal cost, which is telling us how each additional unit is affecting overall cost, it starts at 15, goes down to a low of 8 in this example, and then it increases to up to 19. So it decreases, reaches a low point, and then it accelerates to where it's actually at the end of this process actually larger than when we started. So if I graph the marginal cost, it's going to have kind of a check mark type of behavior. It starts high, reaches the bottom, and then starts to accelerate. And so to see that, I graph the average fixed cost, the average variable cost, the average total cost, and the marginal cost in the same framework. And let me show you that. Alright, so we come down here to this exhibit, and lo and behold, There we go. We got the average fixed cost, which is getting smaller and smaller, the blue line, as output is increasing. We have the average variable cost, which is having a kind of a U-type tendency. It starts here, bottoms out, and then starts to increase. We have the average total cost, which started very high, 65 in our example, reached the low of like 18.4, and then it started to increase as well. The marginal cost started at 15 in our example, reached a low of 8, and then it starts to accelerate. And so we wanted to continue this exercise, the marginal cost would really start to kind of explode. So this is the graph of those concepts, and we can see how they're behaving. So it begs the question, both the graphical depiction and the numerical depiction, why is it that the average variable cost reaches a low point of 10.4 and then starts to increase? Why is it that the average total cost reaches a low point of 18.4 and then starts to increase? Why is it that the marginal cost reaches a low of $8 and then starts to increase? The answer is due to the law of diminishing marginal returns. Remember, the law said, given some fixed costs, which we have in column 2, as more variable costs are incurred, which is occurring in column 3, it said eventually marginal costs would start to increase. And so marginal cost starts to turn up and it starts to accelerate. That is in response to the inefficiencies that are occurring in the production process. We have, on the production side, we have too many inputs, and so our costs are starting to accelerate as production increases. Okay. All right. Let's return back to the to our PowerPoint. We just finished looking at a short-run cost example. Let's now take cost one step further and look at what are known as long-run costs. Okay? So long-run cost concepts, this is where there are no fixed costs. So in the long run, from that perspective, there are no fixed costs. There are only variable costs. And so actually long-run costs are actually easier than short-run costs because you don't have to contend with any type of fixed cost. So here, your long-run total cost will consist of only variable costs. So total cost here consists of only variable costs. There are no fixed costs. The long-run average total cost, which is the focal point of a long-run perspective, is where you can identify what are known as economies of scale, constant returns to scale, and diseconomies of scale. So long-run average total cost allows us to identify those phenomena. Economies of scale, of course, is where as you produce output over a certain range, your costs on average tend to drop, which is a good thing. Constant returns to scale is where in the long run, as you produce output, your costs kind of plateau. They become kind of constant. And diseconomies of scale is a bad thing in the sense that as you produce output in a diseconomies of scale range, your costs on average tend to go up. So as you're producing more output, it's costing you on average more and more to produce each subsequent unit of output. And that's a bad thing because it means that your competitive position could be compromised. Marginal cost in the long run behave just like marginal cost in the short run, in the sense that long-run marginal cost tracks how, when the next unit is produced, how it's going to affect the business's overall costs. Okay. Now, what we need to do is to look at long-run cost is to take an example, and let's go back to our previous cost exhibit. And this time, if I take the short-run cost and I strip out the fixed cost and I strip out the average fixed cost, then all that remains in that cost table are variable costs. So I want to do that. So to illustrate long-run costs, I took that previous table and just removed any type of fixed cost. So there's no fixed cost, and I also removed any type of average fixed cost. So my total cost in the long run is all variable cost. My average total cost is all average variable cost. And so by stripping out the fixed costs, that allows me to evaluate cost behavior in the long run. Notice my marginal cost is still the same as in the short run. It's tracking changes in the variable cost. And so if I were to graph, for example, the total long run total cost and the long run variable cost, they would be the same curve, because there's no difference between them because there's no fixed cost. If I were to graph the long run average total cost, it would be the same as the long run average variable cost because there's no difference between them, such as average fixed cost. Right, and so I did that. So I graphed initially the long run total cost, and that of course now is the same as variable cost because there are no fixed costs. There's no difference between the two curves. They're one and the same. On the average cost side, the long run average total cost, the long run average variable cost are the same. Those two curves collapse and become the same. There's no average fixed cost between them, and the marginal cost behaves just like we had saw in the short run. Now, to identify economies of scale, if I take the long run average total cost curve, this blue curve, this segment where it's decreasing, that is what we call economies of scale. Because as more output is being produced, the cost and average are falling. So economies of scale is where the long run average total costs decrease as the output increases. So as long as that curve is downward sloping, that implies economies of scale. Now where the blue line kind of flattens out, like right in here, that would be the region of constant returns to scale, because the average total costs are kind of flat. Now where the long run average total cost starts to go up, like on this segment here, that would be indicative of this economies of scale, because as more output is being produced, the cost on average are going up. So long run costs are easier because there are no fixed costs to contend with, and when you strip out the fixed costs, the costs become easier to analyze. All right. Last thing we have to say then about cost theory, now that we have the long run cost in tow, is we need to have a brief note about accounting cost versus economic cost. And I say brief because I need to deal with these concepts in a little more detail later, but for now I'm going to make the kind of the cursory distinction between the two. Accounting costs are explicit costs. Explicit costs are costs that have been incurred. So if a business buys a hammer, or if a business hires workers, those costs, those expenses are what we call explicit costs. We can measure them. We know when they occurred. Economic costs, on the other hand, consist of the explicit costs, just like how the accountants do it, but it also includes what are called implicit costs. Implicit costs being a synonym for opportunity costs. So from an economic standpoint, when we're measuring costs, we look at the costs that were incurred, the explicit costs, plus we look at the costs that were not incurred because of the choice made. So we look at opportunity costs. We look at what was sacrificed, what costs were not incurred based on the choice made. And the reason why we are concerned about opportunity costs, we want to make sure that whatever the business chose to do, whatever type of activities it engages in, that was represented the best use of resources. In fact, we want to make sure that the business's choice of activities was in fact the best choice. And so opportunity cost allows us to assess that. And so at this point, explicit costs are costs that have been incurred, which is what accountants typically focus on, and economic costs consist of explicit costs plus an opportunity cost component. And I will explore these cost concepts in more detail in subsequent chapters. Okay. All right. So that concludes the overview of Chapter 8 in terms of production and cost theory. If you have questions about some of the concepts I've introduced, please feel free to send me messages. I'd be happy to respond to them. But I think if you also I know if you spend time reading the material and doing the homework and working through the illustrations in your text, that will also reinforce these concepts, and next thing you know, you'll see that cost of production is really a very useful area for microeconomic inquiry. So until next week, take care, study hard,